because of VBS and a thing or two, but that's good. We'll get it done hopefully. If you did not see when you came in, there's a couple of handouts on the back table there where we used to pick up our communion cups. If you didn't get one or two of those, there's two. One of them is a general kind of outline of the different lessons we're going to try to do in this study, and another one is kind of a outline of tonight's study, tonight's lesson, with some fill-in-the-blank stuff, and hopefully I'll be clear enough on that you can see to fill in most of that anyway. I don't have a copy of that in front of me, so if I miss something, you can get with me later, and we'll try to get that in. But I hope you are as excited about this class as I am. I've been looking forward to this for a while. I've been in a class with this book, and we mentioned that back a while back, by John MacArthur, 12 Ordinary Men. And it was taught to a teenage class, and I was in there kind of just to help as a helper in that class. Our youth minister was teaching at that time, but I sat in on it, and it was good. And then I've read it and heard many lessons about it over the time. But I think it's a very important study for us to do as Christians. And when I asked Ben about teaching this particular topic, he said he thought it would be good. He hadn't been done in a while here, so maybe that would be good. A couple of reasons that I think it's important. Number one is kind of history for us as Christians to kind of see how those 12 men, how all that went when Jesus called his apostles, trained them, and then sent them out, and kind of the process they went through. I think this is just as Christians we need to be familiar with that. And then also maybe the bigger reason behind it is for us to see that how he was able to use these men who were the only thing, as the book says, the only thing extraordinary about them was how ordinary they were and the many faults that they have. For us to look at that and see how that can apply to us when many times we feel like we're not capable of doing something, or we don't have a place, or there's not something we can do. If you look at these 12 men and the enormous task that they had, and how really unprepared they were for it in earthly terms, and then the job that they were able to do and are basically still doing today, I think that should help us, give us confidence in ourselves that, hey, I can do things. I can do more than I think I can. Before we get started, I'd like for us to begin with a prayer. And Brother Mike, would you mind leading us in that prayer? Before we get into this, just a little aside, hit my mind. But hope you had a good afternoon. I know some of us here from Highland Park went down to the White House today to their annual singing there, and that is my wife, Winnie. That's her home congregation, and where she grew up and where we were married. And I tell everybody these little fun facts. And I tell people I was married at the White House. And so not necessarily maybe the one they think about, but it's still the White House, what it says on the sign outside. And I got to see several people there that was very instrumental in our early life when we got married. Lived there for the first 8 or 9 years of when I began my teaching, or I was already teaching, but we lived there in the community and went to church there. So a fine place, and the singing is always just fantastic. And you really can't appreciate it unless you've been there. And even every year, I forget how good it is till I'm in there again. but today it was packed. I wish you could have been there, but if you were, I don't know where you would have sat. I think they announced about 260 people were there, had 40 song leaders, and sang for about an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes. And that was just afternoon singing. They sing in the morning and then have preaching, and then they eat lunch, and then they sing again. But it was just unreal. If you've ever heard that, there's no reason to have instrumental music. You couldn't have heard it. You didn't have to worry about turning your phone off because you wouldn't have heard it ring if it went off. So it was just awesome. Really kind of make goosebumps get on you and maybe tear up on a couple of songs there. Maybe it had a special meaning to you, but it was just an awesome afternoon, and I really enjoyed that. And if you ever get a chance to go, I usually go. So if you don't know the way, you can follow me or Pete. He usually goes too. But it was just a very good afternoon. And then they announced they had a young lady they had been studying with, and she was going to be baptized right after the singing service. So just really a great day there of food and fellowship and singing. So just like I said, hope you had a good afternoon as I did. Kind of fired me up a little bit, I guess, to get started tonight. Our first lesson here, if you got the outline, is the Master who called them. And it's really... This lesson is about the calling and the training of the 12 apostles. That's kind of what we're going to focus on. We're going to hit 4 different little topics as we go through. The first one we talk about is the timing of it. Second is the 12 themselves, not in detail about each 12, but about the 12. Part 3 is about the task, the job they had to do. And then the last part and the most part we'll talk about is the training kind of that they went through. So those are kind of the things that hopefully you'll get from it tonight as we go through. I've heard it said before, and I think it's pretty well sums it up. But if you want to sum up the message of the entire Bible, you can break it down into 3 parts. In the Old Testament, Genesis through Malachi, the message is Jesus is coming. And then in Matthew through John, Jesus is here. And then Acts through Revelations, Jesus is coming back. So those, basically the whole, if you just want to simplify it, thumbnail version of it, that's what the Bible's all about. And the Jews had been told for many years to look for Jesus, that he was coming. They weren't prepared. They didn't know exactly what was going on. But some of them still looking for him. But then when he came, and then the life that he led, and I appreciate Brother Mike's lesson this morning. It was a very good kind of lead up to some of the things I'm going to say today. Hopefully we can kind of expound on some of those things. But the key passages that you see there are basically about the calling. Matthew chapter 10, verses 1 through 4. Mark chapter 3, verses 13 through 19. Luke chapter 6, 12 through 16. And John 6, 60 through 71. And we won't necessarily be going back to those, but those are just kind of where we're coming from. And from the reading in your book, and I did encourage you to get the book if you wanted to. I think it'd be helpful to you. But if you read in the introduction in chapter 1, that's kind of where we're coming from tonight. So let's start off. Let's talk about the timing of it a little bit. We don't always understand God's timing. We get impatient a lot of times, and we want something, like I heard a saying, said, give me patience and give it to me right now. Okay, that's kind of how we are sometimes. I've heard the comedian say one time, said, I invented instant water, but I don't know what to add. But we want everything right now, microwave, give it to me. Some of them, the Jews probably thought, well, he's never going to send the Messiah. So maybe that's why maybe they're surprised when he did come. But I think the timing was perfect. Of course it was, for God had it that way. But it's kind of like, I kind of liken it to our country. The formation of our country. I think the United States and the freedoms that we have, God had a part to play in that because of the restoration movement. I think we were the perfect place for that to happen in time, for the church to be restored. I don't know if it could have happened like it did any other place. So I think it was the perfect timing for our country to be here. The Roman Empire, as bad as they were, it kind of pulled the world together, and the transportation system was good, and it allowed for the spread of the gospel when the church started. So I think God always had a plan and a time that maybe we don't understand, but he did. And I think the timing for Jesus to come and begin his ministry was perfect for many reasons, and maybe we'll touch on some of those tonight. But from some of the lessons that we heard during VBS in the adult class, we learned some of that too. We talked about Jesus and his life and his training, and how he got to, we've got gaps from the age of 12 until 30 where we really don't know a whole lot what happened. And the Bible chose not to tell us that for whatever reason. But I think we can probably look at some things historically and culturally from how the Jews did things and kind of figure out roughly some things that was going on in his life. It was preparing him for where he was. But I appreciate Mike's statement this morning, and I've heard that a few years ago, and not really all that many, and it really struck me, was that the temptation of Jesus, it's not a temptation if you can't fail, okay? And it was. He was God, but he was human, and that's hard for us to wrap our head around. I still don't say that I have completely understand all that. But while he was here on earth, he could have failed, but he didn't. And that part of him and us understanding how that fit together, I think sometimes we kind of gloss over that, and we kind of see him as kind of this mythical figure in a way that it's like, I know he's not even real in some ways. I think it's hard for us to understand the humanity part of him sometimes. And if we can wrap our mind around it, I think that helps us to be a little closer to him. But we do know that when he began his public ministry, he started out in his hometown. And he went to Nazareth, and he was extremely controversial. If you'll remember there, the people of his community, the first time he spoke in the synagogue, it didn't go very well. Sometimes you want to start out of the gate and be successful right away. And I've heard a lot of people who whatever became great in whatever their field was, they were a miserable failure to begin with. And I don't want to say that Jesus was a failure, but as far as being accepted and listened to, it didn't work. And the people there, they literally tried to kill him. They wanted to throw him off a cliff. And I think through God's providence course, he was able to slip through the crowd and get away. But there in Luke chapter 4, 28 through 30, we read about that, where the first time he really came up to spoke to people at the beginning of his ministry, it didn't go very well. In John chapter 1, verse 11, it says, he came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. In Luke 4:24, it says, truly I say to you, no prophet is welcome in his hometown. And I think sometimes that's true of preachers. If you grew up in a certain area, maybe it's hard for people to think of you as who you are as an adult and forget who you were as a kid and some of the things you did. So sometimes it's a little easier maybe to go somewhere else. So, the definition of an expert is a guy with a briefcase from out of town. That's an expert in whatever it is. So, it's kind of easier to believe that sometimes. I know no comparison here, but a little in my mind at least. But when I began, first head coaching football job I had was at my old high school. And, the people there that I played with, I was coaching their kids. And it was kind of, even though I'd been there as an assistant, it was kind of difficult for them to make that switch that now I was the head coach. Hey, I know you when you played. You wasn't that great. What do you know about teaching these kids? And I wasn't that great, I can tell you. I loved the game, and I played hard. But I was, the recruiters weren't beating down my door offering me a football scholarship, but I did understand the game enough to coach it and had been pretty successful. But I don't know that I was well received my first year there as head coach. It took some time to get that built up. So kind of how Jesus was here, I guess, in a way. But on the other hand, kind of ironically, Jesus became tremendously popular among the larger Galilee region. As word of his miracles and his things that he did, as they spread, then the crowds just flocked to him, just massive hordes of people. They came out to see him and hear him. Maybe it was out of curiosity. Maybe that was because they wanted him to feed them, because if the word got out, hey, if you go listen to this guy preach, he fed the whole crowd. You didn't have to bring lunch, dinner and movie, free entertainment, and the miracles that he did, people want to say, well, what's going on with this guy? And the majority of them were kind of fickle and lukewarm and didn't stick with him. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But, he went from the first time he spoke to not being received to everybody was crowded around him to the point that he couldn't even rest or have time to eat. So, if we look at that from a human standpoint, you say, well, man, that was going great. If he's going to begin his ministry, all these big crowds and everybody there flocking to him, that was great. And maybe if he wanted his message to have the maximum impact here, he needed to play off his popularity. And today, if you got a politician, they're running, and they want power and they want to be accepted, they're looking at those public opinion polls. What is my approval rating this week? They want to know that, because I'm going to adjust my message so that I keep everybody coming back. If they're wanting to hear this, I'm going to say that. And if they're not wanting to hear that, I'm going to cut that out. Or even if I believe that, and I may try to push that in my agenda when I get elected. To get elected, if I don't need to say that, then maybe I shouldn't really harp on that part. I'll just kind of say that off to the side a little bit. That's not how Jesus did it. He could have accomplished probably what he wanted to accomplish that way, and through the wisdom of man, that's how he should have done it. But that's not how he chose to do it. Matter of fact, he did exactly the opposite. At about the time that the crowds had really reached their peak, when he had people just where he couldn't even move, they were so thick, he began to preach his message that was so confrontational and offensive that most of the multitude melted away. And this left a very few devoted ones. We read there in John chapter 6, verses 60 through 67. To the point that after that, Jesus asked his apostles, he said, "Hey, are you going too? Are you going to stay with me?" And they said, "No, where are we going to go?" Peter said, "You have the words of life. We know who you are. Where else would we go? You're it." So they kind of passed that test there, that when things got tough as far as the teaching he was doing, they didn't melt away. So also here, bear in mind about this time, that about the time he selected the 12, this was the time when he was beginning to face the reality of his impending death. Okay, the outcry of the rulers was getting strong, and even the ones who didn't get along with each other, they united on one thing: we don't like Jesus. Okay, so this guy's got to go. He's threatening all of us, what we say. And we've mentioned this in class before, but why did the Jewish leadership, why did they not like Jesus? What were some things? And I'm asking, what did they not like about him? Anybody? Right. He wouldn't, and he threatened their position. And I think, personally, I think a lot of it was jealousy. He is here and he's going to displace us. They had this system in place for the Jewish leaders that they were in power. And when he came along preaching the message he did, that didn't go over well. The other thing was that he called them out on who they were, and over and over and over called them hypocrites. And it was very important to them for their social standing in the community and in the land of what they were thought of. And when he started doing that they didn't like that. I'm holier than thou kind of attitude, and he's telling y'all that I'm just, I'm trash. I'm a liar and a conniver and all these kind of things, and they didn't appreciate that. So it was at this time when this was really coming to a head, this rising hostility of all the religious leaders, that he began to choose the ones that was going to be his closest group. And also at this time, his whole character of his ministry kind of changed. At first he was drawing the crowds, and he spoke to big groups, and he was doing miracles, and he was preaching this new message with authority that was different than what they'd ever heard, and he was drawing the crowds. But then it changed to where now my main priority is I'm still going to speak with the crowds, but now I'm going to turn to I've got to train these guys that's going to carry on when I'm gone. So that's the kind of part where we're going to jump into it is where now he's beginning to focus on these men who he's going to leave his work in his place. So how did he choose them? We look at Luke chapter 6, verse 12 there. It says he went off to the mountain to pray. He spent the whole night in prayer to God. Okay, so he prayed about it. And what are we to do? Too many times I hear people say, I've done everything else. The only thing left to do now is pray. That's the reverse order. What should be the first thing we do? Pray, okay? Even in the day, and I'm guilty of this sometimes. I'm pretty regular about my end of the day prayer, but there are times when I get up and I'm in a hurry or whatever, and I don't start the day out. asking for help and guidance throughout the day. We kind of get the cart before the horse. But here he went to pray. Now, a little side note here, I never heard this till I started studying about this lesson. But one of the Greek expression there for this, it's not the prayer to God, it's the prayer of God. And he was in prayer with all three of the Godhead. The Holy Trinity was all there together. And he was the human side of him, I need to pray, and the divine side of him, I need to commune with the Father and the Holy Spirit. And I think that was an important part of that prayer. So he was there probably, some people say, about 10 hours straight in prayer. That's a long time. Sometimes we get a little anxious when whoever's leading prayer goes over about 3 or 4 minutes. Like, no, okay, let's wrap this up. It's time to eat, But he prayed all night long. Now, what was he praying for? I think that's a discussion here. Some would say, well, he was praying for wisdom in who he chose. And that's a matter of opinion. I'm not telling you what to think here. I'm telling what I kind of think about this and the author says this, and I kind of agree with him, is I don't think he was praying for clarity on who to pick. I think more so he was praying for these men, and that to give them strength to develop and grow and do the things of this job that's this big, heavy responsibility that's going to be placed on them. I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know what he was praying for. I'm sure maybe who he picked was part of it, but I think maybe as God in the flesh, he knew that this was the ones to pick. And he knew their frailties, and we're going to get into all that when we study about them. And he knew that they all had weaknesses, but he was really praying for them to grow and grow into the job. Sometimes you get a job because you're ready for it. Sometimes you get a job or a position that you have to grow into. And I think that was kind of the apostles here. They kind of had to be groomed and taught and prepared for this job that lay ahead of them. Okay. All right, part 2, the 12. When that night of prayer was over, he went back to where his disciples were and he summoned them. So out of the ones, we said a big group of them had left. There'd been thousands. A smaller group now, we don't know how many, but probably in the hundreds at least. There was still a pretty big group of them, but out of this larger group then, he chose the 12 in particular and appointed them to be apostles. They didn't apply. They didn't turn in a resume. They didn't raise their hand and step forward. If you like this job, he chose them, and he appointed them. Up to this point, they were learners like everybody else. In our book, the writer here, he talks about their calling being in 4 parts. And he said the first part was their conversion, a call to conversion. And that was when some of them, especially, was following John. And then when Jesus was baptized and he told everybody this is the Lamb of God, then they turned and began to follow him. But they were still doing their jobs. They were still fishing or tax collection, whatever it was. They still had their earthly jobs. So first call was that call to conversion. Phase 2 of that was their call to ministry. Pushed them out when he pushed out to shore there in the boat so he could teach, and then get them together after that when Peter let down his nets, and he called them to come and follow me. I'll make you fishers of men. And then maybe the third phase of that was their call to apostleship, the part that we're getting into tonight. And then the last part of that, their calling was their call to martyrdom. When he ascended and left them with a job, now there was a call, are you going to do this till death? You're committed your life to it. So 4 parts of that calling. But on this night, on this day, this morning, when he came back, he picked out these 12 out of that group that he had. And, that's kind of a common thing. You get a bigger group, and then you kind of break it down. And as you go through the weeding out process, some of y'all have been through college, they have some of those freshman classes, particularly if certain majors that you're going into, whether it's pre-med or engineering or something, there's a few of those classes they throw in there at the first just to let you see if you really want to be there or not. Okay, I had one of those. The first college class I ever took, 8 o'clock in the morning was freshman chemistry, and it was a big group of people in that class. And our professor, the first few days, he just ran wide open, pedal to the metal, everything that you're supposed to know about chemistry from high school, all in like a week, and we're going to take a test on it. And a lot of people didn't do very good, including me. And he passed the test back out. He just kind of threw them down on the desk, face down, let you turn them over, and there was a lot of red. And he said, hey, if you fail this class, you probably need to go drop my class because you're not going to make it. He said, probably need to drop out of college and go get you a job flipping burgers because you're probably not college material. You know, and a lot of people left. I didn't, you know. That kind of challenged me, like, I'm not quitting. I may fail this class, but I'll be in here till the bitter end. So that was good for me that he pushed the right button for me to, okay, I'm gonna do this now. And then I saw that professor years later when I was teaching chemistry, and I come back and I said, hey, Doc, you probably don't remember, but you told me I need to drop your class. I got a degree in chemistry. And I teach other kids now, you know, so I appreciate you the way you say it. But I hung in there. I thank you for that. So, you know, this, as he had kind of weeded them down, they get down, turning the butter, kind of let the cream rise to the top here. All right, so what about the 12? Why did he pick 12? Why not 8? Why not 24, 7? You know, there's a lot of other good biblical numbers in there that he could have picked, but he picked 12. Well, that number has symbolic importance here. Number one, that there were 12 tribes in Israel. And we read in Revelation where he says that these 12 apostles will rule over the 12 tribes. Not getting into Revelation, I'm just saying that's what it says. But here they were picked. That same number of 12 was under the old covenant. Now there was 12 here, but instead of 12 tribes, it was just 12 apostles. And it was important enough that there be 12, you remember, that after Judas hung himself, that they cast lots through his guidance then to pick Matthias to take his place. So it was important that they have 12. You know, it was also a big part of this. We mentioned a while ago about him being rejected by the established government and religion there of the Jews. Part of that was a direct slap in the face, if you want to look at it that way, or a direct indictment against them. Is that none of these 12 that he picked to occupy these lead spots in the new kingdom and the new covenant had any training in their system. The Jewish religious and governmental system at that time was corrupt. It was not anything close to what it was supposed to be. And as I was studying this and reading about it, it kind of reminds me of our government a little bit. You know, I think our government now, if our founding fathers who wrote the Constitution would look at today and how things are going, it's like, that's not exactly what we had in mind. They're kind of getting off out in the weeds here a little bit. And I think that's kind of what Jesus was saying here to them is, you know, y'all have corrupted this thing. You made it all legalistic. You're over minute little details, and we won't get into all that right now. We'll touch on some of it later. But you know, y'all are way off, and because of that, I'm not picking any of y'all to be head in my group right here. You know, if you were assembling a group to do something, to teach, and something, and none of them had any expertise in that area, they'd be like, why are you picking them? Why you don't pick these people who've got training in that and education? Well, because they were not worthy of it, really, basically. So, like I said, we'll get a lot more into that. But the picking of the 12 had a lot to do with that. A little bit here, and we'll kind of get off on the side. And I really didn't know where to put this in here, but I'll do it now because it's going to relate to some different things we talk about. And might be able to shed a lot more on this expertise than I can. But I tried to study a little bit about the educational system of a Jewish boy during this time, during Jesus' time when he was growing up. And like I said, I think there's things we can learn from how they did things, and maybe we can kind of figure maybe that's kind of the path that Jesus took. But to begin with, we read all the way back in Deuteronomy, how are we told to teach our kids? At home, okay? Homeschool started back then. So you're to learn from your parents, all right? From a child, from the very early child, they're to see it, they're to hear it. You teach it to them every day in every way you do. You don't have a set class time. It's just as you live, you're teaching them lessons. And that's how it was originally, and that's how it even was this time, is that the parents had a big responsibility for teaching their kid. And I think even in the church today, I think we, as parents, sometimes are guilty of this, is we don't spend enough time teaching our kids at home. We think, well, they'll learn that in Bible class. We'll let the Bible class teachers handle that. And they will, and that's good, but there's things that they should know and learn before they ever get in that Bible class. Okay? So to begin with, they were taught at home. Then as things progressed, and then after the Jews were taken away into captivity, when they came back, the synagogue began to be a thing. And every community kind of had a synagogue, a place for worship and education, and a rabbi there who worked in there. But in general, at age about 5 or 6, kind of elementary school started. And the kids came in, especially the boys, and they learned to read and write so they could study the Torah, the Old Testament that they had at that time. So they began with that. And if you think about in our history of our country, what did people used to teach their kids to read and write from? The Bible. Okay, they didn't have, a lot of times they didn't have a community school, or if they did, but they used the Old King James Bible as a textbook, and that's what they read. And that's how they learned how to read and write those things, and that's kind of how they were. They read and learned about the Torah, and they as elementary from there. Then along about age 10, they began to look at the oral interpretation of some of that, what that meant or what somebody had said it meant. Then at 13, we've heard Jewish talk about the bar mitzvah for boys. Basically, that means son of commandment. So at 13, they were old enough now to where the parent was not really responsible for them. You're responsible for yourself. And you should have learned enough by then about the law and the way Judaism that you're able to kind of take some responsibility. And then at age 15, they began to study what's called the Talmud. It's parts of some other the writings that they had, that some of the rabbis and interpretations and things had been written about what the law meant, how to observe it, how that applied to the cultural part of being a Jew. And then at 18, you're ready to be married. At 20, you begin a profession, whatever your vocation had been trained in. And then if you showed a real promise as a student, way back down there, about the time high school we look at, then you were able to study more, and you might study with a rabbi or teacher who you followed. And the way that kind of happened is people would choose or I guess apply, take permission to study with that teacher, with that master, with that rabbi. And they would leave home time, a lot of times, follow him wherever he went. And it was it was a more intensive, instead of just a little part of the day in a classroom, it was like Jesus was with his apostles. It was 24/7. You followed them around, you lived with them, and you learned everything about them. And your goal was to be an imitator. And what Mike preached about today, be imitators of me as I am of Christ, what Paul said. But, you're to follow that leader, the point that you want to not just learn enough to graduate or get a degree or get a job, but you want to be like that person. You want to imitate them. And that part of education, I think, is kind of how a lot of this pulled away. So him calling them to follow him was not, I don't think that was uncommon at that time. Not many people, only very few were able to do that, but to be called to follow a rabbi or a teacher, and Jesus was called rabbi many times by many different people, that was important part of their training, was more intensive. Just like me as a teacher at school, we got 180 days of school. I got kids in class we were on the block system, so hour and a half every day of the week. And it's semester at 90 days, basically, then I get a new crew and that class is over with. So I'm only with them an hour a day, but under this, you're with them 24/7. You are there to learn and watch, and not just what was taught, but also the example that was set and how to deal with situations. Mike, can you expand on that any? All right, like I said, there's a lot of that to get into, and I'll some things we'll mention along as we go through some others. But also the title that they had in Luke chapter 6, verse 13 says, "He chose 12, whom he also called apostles." The Greek word there, apostolos, I'm not speak Greek, but something along those lines, apostolos, literally means one who is sent. And that word is not a translation from the original language. It is a transliteration, okay, where instead of trying to take the meaning of the word, they take the letters that spell it out and try to get the complementary letters of that in our language and then make a word out of that. And it's like the word baptism, okay? You know, the baptism, baptize, was not a translation. It was transliterated. And probably most of us know the story of that. But when the King James Bible was being translated, baptism was not immersion. Okay, and from what I understand, that would not have been good if they would have translated it as dip or immerse, buried. So they just called it. Okay, we're going to call that word baptizo, baptize, and then we can say it sprinkling or whatever. Okay, that's kind of how this word was. Not that they had to change the meaning, but they just kind of took that word and made apostle out of it. But the word apostle means sent ones. But they were more than a messenger. That title and the way they understood that to be at their time was that you were like a delegate, an ambassador, official representative. And in the word, an exact parallel in Aramaic language, what Jesus spoke, not Hebrew, but Aramaic, was shaliah. And a shaliah was something that they definitely understood in their culture and their society in that time. The Sanhedrin was a good example. Sanhedrin was like the Supreme Court of their day for the Jewish nation, made up of 70 of the elders, and then the head of it, the presiding officer, all that was the chief priest. But the shaliah was an official representative of the Sanhedrin. If somebody came to you from them and he said, "I'm a shaliah from them," you know that he was speaking on their behalf. And he had all the authority and all the power of the Sanhedrin standing there and telling you that themselves. So, they didn't have a cell phone to pick up and tell you. They would send a representative. So he didn't deliver his message. That shaliah delivered the message of the ones who sent him. It was by their authority, and he was exercising their authority. So the apostles then were the ones sent out. They were the shaliah. They were the official representative of Jesus, and they were not telling what they believed or what they interpretation of it. They were telling you what, with the authority of Jesus, what was supposed to happen. Comments on that? Okay. All right, part 3, the task. Okay, that kind of leads us into that familiar role of shaliah in their culture. That kind of defined what their job was. Obviously, Christ was going to delegate his authority to these 12, send them out with a message. They would represent him as their official delegate, speak and act with the same authority as the one who sent them. Apostle was therefore a title, but it had a lot of respect to it. A great deal of privilege and respect for saying that you were apostle. You were not a disciple. Disciple was a learner or a follower. You were a student. But when you became an apostle, now you were going out with authority. You learned your lesson. Now it was for you to go out and spread that. In Mark 3:14 says, "And he appointed 12 so that they would be with him and that he would send them out to preach." So notice in that verse there's 2 steps to it. The first step is he had to call them in first. You can't send them out until you call them in. So he called them in to go through that training period, which, like our Brother Mike said a few minutes ago, was about 18 months or so, which is not a lot of time, okay? For us today, you get a 2-year degree, associate's degree, that's going to take 2 years, and a lot of apprentice programs are 2 years. This was 18 months to do the most important job in the world, really. And that was a brief period of time, so he had to get he had to cram a lot in their head in this short amount of time. So it was critical here that they be with him. So he identifies them, appoints them, brings them under his tutelage, that they would be with him, there it says in Luke 6. In Luke 9, several months later, he gives them power to work miracles, cast out demons. So not until he had called them in and trained them was he able to send them out with this power. Up to this point, like we said a while ago, he was speaking to huge crowds most of the time. But with the calling of the 12 here in Luke 6, his focus moved to train in them. He still drew large crowds. He still taught them, but he was using that a lot of times so that they would see. So no longer just disciples, they're now apostles or shaleah. They occupy an important office. Luke uses that word apostle 6 times in his gospel and about 30 times in the book of Acts. So he's stressing the job that they have to do. Their role in the gospel here in the Gospels, primarily they were taking the message to Israel. They were taking the Jews. In Acts, that changed. Now instead of taking it to Jews, they were engaged in founding the church. Okay, which we all know if somebody needs to know what to do to be saved or what church is about, that's the first book we're going to go to probably is Acts. Okay, so not only would they found the church, but they also played a pivotal leadership as the early church grew and branched out. They became the channel that most of the New Testament was given through. They received the truth from God by divine revelation. Say that very explicitly there in Ephesians 3:5, where Paul says that the mystery of Christ, which in earlier ages was made known, has now been revealed in his holy apostles and prophets in the Spirit. So now that mystery that they didn't completely understand, now it was being clarified through the apostles. That was their job. They were his mouthpiece. They were the connection to this. And remember what we just said, they didn't preach a human message. This was not what they believed or they thought. If it had, there'd been 12 different versions of it. There was one. The truth was given to them by direct revelation. They were the source of all true church doctrine. Look in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 42. It describes the activities of the early church in these terms. It says they were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching or doctrine and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. So the early Christians, what they were doing to become Christians, to live as Christians, they were following through the teaching that the apostles was giving them, their doctrine. And, that teaching is recorded in the New Testament. That's the only rule that we have today that we can test sound doctrine. If we want to see, is something right? Is it correct? Is somebody a false teacher? If it does not in line with what Jesus gave to the apostles to give to us, then it's not correct, okay? That's how we judge it. That's the standard. When we have a standard of measurement, the metric system that we hadn't embraced in this country very well, but most of the world does. What is a meter? Or what is a liter? Some of us may not really have a firm grasp of that if we don't deal with it every day. But I know I tell kids at school all the time we're saying about this. I said, y'all have a lot better understanding of what a liter is than I did when you're your age. Because you get a 2-liter Coke or 3-liter bottle of Pepsi or whatever. I said, if my mom had sent me to the store when I was your age and told me to go get 3 liters of Coke, I wouldn't know whether I get a basket or I need to back up or pick up to the loading dock. I didn't have a clue how much that was. But there has to be a standard of what that is. So somewhere there is a measurement that this is a meter and everything compares to that. And our standard of measurement for everything that we do as Christians is the doctrine that the apostles taught, that they received from direct revelation from Christ. Next thing, they were also virtues, examples of virtue. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 5 calls them holy apostles. They set a standard for godliness and true spirituality. They were men of character and integrity, and they kind of set the standard that all church leaders from here on, that's how they should live, is the same way that the apostles lived. So not only were they the founded church, but they were also an example of what a leader was to look like. Okay? We say that in education a lot of times. You can't be it until you see it. That's why it's important for us in education, is in middle school age in particular, we try to get kids out, have guest speakers come in. There's a thing that in state now has been going on for a few years. It's great. It's called WOW, World of Work, where they have these centers where they'll have people from all these different fields of businesses and careers, and they have those kids come in as middle schoolers and talk to them and see what they do, and they'll see what they can become. Because me, for example, when I was in my little town growing up, the only people who went to college that I saw was my teachers or either a doctor, and that was it. So that was really all I knew. If you were going to, I didn't know any engineers. I didn't know really know if I knew a pharmacist. I don't know. But there's so many careers we didn't know about. So if you can see it, to be it. So here they could see what a leader looked like by the example that they lived. They also, as we said before, they had a unique power there to perform miracles. The purpose of that, it was not a magic show, it was to confirm the message. Hebrews 2, verses 3 through 4 says that after it was first spoken through the Lord, it was confirmed to us by those who heard, God also testifying with them by signs and wonders and various miracles, by gifts of the Holy Spirit according to his own will. So the New Testament here indicates that only the apostles and those who were close to them, who they laid hands on, they were close associates of them, had that power to perform miracles. So that showed them at that time, they didn't have the New Testament to go by. They couldn't go back and look and see, well, this is how the early church did it. They were living it. So that's how it was shown to them that these people were who they said they were, is they had that power. And you remember where some had tried to buy that power, or they wanted it for the power and not for what it was meant to do, and that was, of course, not allowed. And people today who try to claim that they can do miracles and heal and all that, and they hadn't read the New Testament very well, or they'd know that's totally off the table. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 12, there he speaks of miracles as the signs of the apostles. So the purpose of those, the reason they could do those was so that they could prove to the people who they were and by the authority they spoke. Okay? Questions or comments about that one? Okay, let's get into the last part, training. So after Jesus had summoned his disciples and appointed the 12, they needed to be taught. Okay, they gave up everything they had, whether they were fishermen or tax collector or carpenter or whatever it may have been that they did for a living. They left it and walked away from it. And in order to be trained for something that they didn't really have any natural aptitude to do. Okay, this was not something that came easy to them. It was not something they were. Some people take something like athletics. Just little kid pick up a ball and when they're little and they can just throw it and say, well, he's going to be a pitcher or quarterback or something. He got that natural ability, or they got good speed or whatever. They've got something for that. They didn't have that natural talent for what they going to do. Have to be taught. We've heard a lot of times that Christianity is a taught religion, not something that you inherit from your parents. Just because your grandparents or your parents were faithful members of the church, if you don't learn it, if you don't own it, if that faith doesn't become yours, then you're not going to be faithful to God throughout your life. You're not going to follow Christ if it's not something that you do. It has to be within you. So they had to do that. So for the next 18 months or so of their life, they would have that intensive 24/7 training there for the most important job in the world. The good thing is that they had Christ before them. He was with them to show them how it's supposed to be done. They could listen to his teaching when he talked to the big crowds. They could ask him questions. We see many times in the New Testament where they asking him questions. They could watch how he dealt with people. They could just enjoy that intimate fellowship with him in every kind of setting that there were. And we'll get into this a little bit later in some of the other lessons, but, there was a close relationship here. And he was closer to some than he was to others. We have maybe a group of friends or people we worked with, but all of us have that one group who's even closer. You got friends, and maybe you got your best friend, okay? And he was somewhat like that. But, even some of the names he had for him, he gave them nicknames. Growing up, people you hung out with, especially probably the guys, some people you may not even know their name. You may not remember, somebody you went to school with. You just always called them Shorty or whatever, My dad worked in the mines, and several of my family has, but that's a big thing in the coal mines is everybody has a nickname, not too many people who know their name. And my dad was a big guy. And a lot of times your nickname was either told something about you or something totally opposite. My dad was 6'7", 325 pounds, and they called him Tiny. That was his nickname. Okay, so if you met him, it's like, that's Tiny? Not what I expected, So same way the name with Peter, with the sons of thunder, some of these different names they had was kind of names that Jesus had given them that you would only get if you were close to somebody, okay? So like I said, we'll get into that as we get into our other lessons particularly. But he was there to encourage them when they got discouraged, to correct them lovingly when they made mistakes, and patiently to instruct them. We're going to look at that in just a second, how patient he was. And really, that's how the best learning always occurs. It isn't just information that's passed on. I've learned this as a teacher, and you know that as a student, is everybody learns differently. Some people learn from lecture, some from hands-on. but seeing or doing. But all of us, there has to be some kind of relationship there before you really learn, and there has to be that kind of trust that's developed there, so that you can learn with them, and that you're going to the teacher is going to care about you and want what's best for you. And if you make a mistake, they're going to take you aside and show you what you could do better, how to do that better. That's how we learn. That's how they learned. So it was 24/7 intensive training there that they went through with Jesus. It wasn't an easy process. It wasn't easy for them. It wasn't easy for Jesus. The 12 could be amazingly thick-headed. We see over and over and over that there's probably some reasons that they weren't part of the academic elite. We said, well, if you showed a good deal of promise as a student that you could move on to do more, I don't think they met the cut. Okay, they didn't pass muster. Now, our education system in the United States is our theory of education is we're going to educate everybody, and we try to make our education system we teach everybody. We want everybody to finish 12th grade, graduate. They hold schools to a high standard of what percentage of your students graduate high school. Some countries are not like that. A lot of countries, even in Europe, once you get to about the 8th grade, you take a test, one test. And if you pass it, you get to go on for further academic. If you don't, you washed out and you go to vocational. Okay? They don't try to teach everybody. All right? So here, they probably would not have passed the test. Okay? A lot of times he said here, like in Matthew chapter 15, 16 through 17, and again in 16:9, he says, "Are you without understanding? Do you not yet understand?" I've told you this over and over. Do you not understand? Are you not getting it? Okay. In Luke 24:25, "O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe." So again, he chastised them a lot of times that they weren't maybe learning as fast as they should. But I think it's very important that the Bible here does not try to cover that up. It shows them with all their defects and all their warts and all the problems that they had. It's a reminder, I think, that our faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but the power of God. 1 Corinthians 2 and 5. So I think that's the point I made to begin with. I think this study is important. It's not just for the history of it, so we understand kind of how the church was established and these guys' role in it, but it's also to understand that we can do great things too. If these guys could do it, we can do it. Okay, I've heard people do that. That's kind of how it was. I did not grow up, I was an administrator in school for 13 years. I did not grow up with my goal to be a principal. I told them when I was a little kid, I didn't get all the other kids together and we're going to play school and I'm going to be the principal. I didn't do that. Okay, that was not my goal in life, was to do that. It's kind of the Lord led me to that vocation, I think. But that kind of happens, and I think that's kind of how it's here. Is he shows them that even though maybe that's not what they thought they wanted to do, that's where they ended up, and they were prepared for it. So what are some things that they were so difficult for the apostles? Well, first of all, they lacked spiritual understanding. They were slow to hear, slow to understand. At various times they were thick, dull, stupid, and blind. All of those terms or their equivalents are used describing the New Testament. I didn't make those up. Okay. Even after his resurrection, Jesus stayed around for another 40 days on earth to try to be sure and do a little cram session there at the end to be sure that he had it. In Acts 1 through 3 says that during this time he was speaking of things pertaining to the kingdom of God. He was still teaching them right up to the moment he ascended into heaven. So their training was up until his death, and then even after, he was still preparing them for that job. The second problem is probably one of the biggest problems was their lack of humility. They spent a lot of their time arguing about who's going to be the greatest. Okay, that power thing was mentioned today. I don't know, it's a human thing about us, but we like to be in charge. That power, it seems to even corrupt good people when they get in certain positions. I've got a friend who was my neighbor growing when I lived in Winfield, and he was a newspaper guy. Some of y'all may know I may be telling on him here, but I'm not going to mention his name. But he was a good guy. He was on our school board and very active and supportive. His kids were in school. Some was in the class with my girls. He got elected to the state representative not too long ago, and I met him a few days ago. And I don't know, he's a little bit different. I kind of feel like maybe he's starting to like that power of being, being down there and make some rules. I don't know. Everybody's not like that, and maybe he's not, but I kind of get that feeling. Okay, so how did he overcome that? He washed their feet. He modeled servanthood, even to death on the cross. So he showed them what it was like to be humble. Third, they lacked faith. In Matthew alone, Jesus says to, "Oh, you little faith," there in 6:38, 26, 14:31, and 16:8. In Mark 40, he asked them, "How is it you have no faith?" So what did Jesus do in them to remedy that? He just kept doing miracles and work. He was patient. A lot of times the stuff he did was maybe more for their benefit than it was for the people he did it for, but so they could see it. Matter of fact, in John 20:30, he says, "In the presence of his disciples, so their faith could be strengthened." Fourth, they lacked commitment. We saw that on the night he was betrayed. They all scattered. Okay, when it come right down to it, they got scared and run. Fifth, they lacked power. On their own, they were weak, helpless, especially when confronted with the enemy. And that faithlessness left them so that they weren't able to harness the power that they had. And I think that's very true of us today. I think we have a lot of power. We're just too afraid to use it sometimes. But then on the day of Pentecost, he sent the Holy Spirit to indwell and empower them. Says, "You shall receive power of the Holy Spirit to come upon you. You shall witness to me in Jerusalem and all Judea, Samaria, and the end of the earth." So in there in Acts 1:8, that promise was fulfilled. We'll sum it up here pretty quick. We're about out of time. But how were they seen by the people of Jerusalem? Well, Acts 4:13 says, "Now as they observed the confidence of Peter and John and understood they were uneducated and untrained men, they were amazed and began to recognize them as having been with Jesus." So we see some words there that describe them as just being ignorant, not very smart, not very intelligent. But at the same time, they saw who they had trained them, and they saw that was beginning to rub off on them, that they were going to be like that. It says, "A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who's perfectly trained will be his teacher." All right, one more little point. The apostles' relative brief training with Jesus bore eternal fruit. We said that to begin with. They were scattered like sheep. They were timid, remorseful. But then when he came, pulled them back together, they had that power and they were able to go out and do things that changed the world. And that change is still happening even today, over 2,000 years since that time. And us and where we are and what we're able to do, the power we have, is because of them. So we want to get into and learn more about these 12 men and kind of who they were as humans and some of the things they were able to do. And some of them didn't tell us a whole lot about, but also we want to apply this to see how we can apply it to us so that we'll be better prepared to do the job too, to go forth and spread the word. Thank you for your time tonight, and hopefully come back next week. And if you get the book, if you'll read ahead, we're still going to be in chapter 1 next week. We'll get a little bit further into that before we start speaking about specific individuals, and we'll start with Peter, as you saw. Okay, thank you, and quick prayer before we go. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for many blessings. Thank you for allowing us to come together to worship you, to learn more about your word, to sing songs of praise in your name. Pray, Father, that we would take this time we've been together today, that it would strengthen us, make us stronger, so as we go out in the world, as we separate and go our separate ways, we're outnumbered when it comes to those who are believers around us. Pray, Father, that we would have the strength and the faith that we could be a shining light to the community around us. Be the ones who are sick, ones who lost loved ones. Pray that you would help them, that we would do whatever we can to help them also. All these prayers we ask in Christ's name. Amen.